Standing majestically on the Giza Plateau, the Great Pyramid has captivated humanity for over 4 millennia. Built with mathematical precision that rivals modern engineering, this ancient wonder weighs approximately 6 million tons and was constructed with an accuracy that places it within 3/60th of a degree of true north. But here's what makes the Great Pyramid truly extraordinary. Despite centuries of study, we still don't definitively know how it was built or why. The structure contains over 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing up to 15 tons, assembled across a 13-acre base to reach an original height of 481 feet. And for nearly 4,000 years, it stood as the tallest human-made structure in the world. Yet, two fundamental questions remain unanswered. Questions that challenge everything we think we know about ancient civilization. First, how was it built? How did a Bronze Age civilization, working with copper tools and wooden sledges, quarry, transport, and precisely position billions of multi-ton stone blocks? Second, why was it built? Was it truly just a tomb for a pharaoh? Or does its sophisticated design serve a purpose we've yet to understand? Tonight, we'll examine these questions by first establishing the orthodox view, then systematically deconstructing it with some of the most credible alternative theories. What we'll discover is that the more we learn about the pyramids, the more mysterious they become, and the more they challenge our assumptions about the capabilities of ancient civilizations. According to mainstream Egyptology, the Great Pyramid's purpose is clear and unambiguous. They believe it was built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, who ruled during Egypt's 4th dynasty, around 2580 to 2560 BCE. This massive structure was designed to ensure the pharaoh's journey and rebirth in the afterlife, serving as his eternal resting place and a monument to his divine power. They believe the pyramid is part of a larger complex that included smaller pyramids for queens, mastaba tombs for nobles, and a mortuary temple connected by a causeway to a valley temple near the Nile. This elaborate arrangement follows the traditional Egyptian belief system, where the pharaoh, considered a living god, required proper burial facilities to maintain cosmic order and ensure his successful transition to the afterlife. The construction timeline, according to Orthodox theory, spanned approximately 20 years during Khufu's reign. This estimate is based on the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE and recorded what Egyptian priests told him about the pyramid's construction. Modern Egyptologists have refined this timeline using archaeological evidence and mathematical calculations about workforce productivity. The construction method, as accepted by mainstream archaeology, involved a massive skilled workforce, estimated at around 20,000 to 30,000 people. Now, these weren't slaves, as popular culture often depicts, but rather seasonal workers, farmers who worked on the pyramid during the Nile's annual flood, when agricultural work was impossible. Recent archaeological discoveries of worker villages near the pyramids do support this theory, showing evidence of well-fed laborers who received medical care and proper burials. The tools used were typical of the Bronze Age. Copper chisels and picks for quarrying, wooden sledges for transportation, and ropes made from plant fibers. The Egyptians had sophisticated knowledge of metallurgy for their time, creating bronze tools that were harder than pure copper, though still relatively soft by modern standards. The quarrying process began in nearby limestone quarries, where workers would cut blocks using copper tools, wooden wedges, and lever systems. The massive granite blocks used in the king's chambers and other interior spaces were quarried from Aswan, nearly 500 miles south of Giza. They were then apparently transported down the Nile during the annual flood season, when the river was high enough to carry heavy barges. The most challenging aspect of the orthodox construction theory involves the massive external ramp required to lift blocks to the pyramid's upper levels. This ramp would have been a marvel of engineering in itself, requiring millions of tons of material and extending for miles across the desert. As each level of the pyramid was completed, the ramp would have been raised and extended. creating a colossal earthwork that would have dwarfed many ancient structures. Once the blocks reached the construction site, teams of workers would use a combination of ramps, levers, and pure human strength to maneuver each of these stones into its precise position. The final step involved fitting the blocks together with such precision that a knife blade cannot fit between many of the joints. This baseline narrative has dominated archaeological thinking for over a century, supported by discovery of worker villages, some tool remains, and certain construction marks found within the pyramid itself. The orthodox view presents the Great Pyramid as the culmination of centuries of pyramid building evolution, representing the pinnacle of Old Kingdom engineering and religious architecture. But of course, that's just one theory. While the orthodox narrative provides a comprehensive framework, it faces significant challenges when examined closely. These problems aren't minor inconsistencies. They are fundamental issues that question whether the accepted construction methods could actually have built the pyramid we see today. The first major challenge concerns the tools supposedly used in construction. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Egyptians possessed copper chisels, bronze implements, and stone hammers. However, modern experiments have revealed the severe limitations of these tools when applied to pyramid construction. Copper, even when hardened into bronze, remains relatively soft compared to the materials used in the pyramid. The limestone blocks, while workable with copper tools, would have required an enormous expenditure of time and effort. More problematically, the granite elements, particularly the massive blocks in the king's chamber, pose an almost insurmountable challenge for copper implements. Granite is one of the hardest stones on Earth, composed primarily of quartz, feldspar, and mica. Modern experiments attempting to cut granite with copper tools have shown that the metal becomes blunt after just a few strikes, requiring constant resharpening. The precision cuts visible in the pyramid's granite elements, including the king's chamber's sarcophagus, display tool marks that suggest cutting methods far more advanced than what copper chisels could achieve. The massive external ramp theory presents equally daunting challenges. Engineers have calculated that to reach the pyramid's apex, an external ramp would need to extend for over a mile at a manageable gradient of 8 to 10 degrees. This ramp would require approximately 17 million tons of material, nearly 3 times the mass of the pyramid itself. More puzzling is the complete absence of archaeological evidence for such a massive construction. Where are the remains for these millions of tons of ramp material? While some argue it was removed after construction, the logistics of dismantling and disposing of such a vast earthwork would have been almost as challenging as building the pyramid itself. Perhaps the most compelling problem is the extraordinary precision evident throughout the pyramid. The base is level to within just 2.1 centimeters over its entire 13-acre area. The stone blocks fit together with joints so tight that a knife blade cannot penetrate them. The internal chambers are positioned with mathematical precision that suggests advanced surveying and engineering capabilities. This level of accuracy exceeds what would be expected from the proposed construction methods. Moving multi-ton blocks up ramps, using sledges and human power, would inevitably result in positioning errors that would accumulate throughout the structure. Yet, the pyramid maintains its precision from base to apex. In 2007, French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, after decades of studying pyramid construction, proposed a revolutionary solution that would overturn everything we thought we knew about ancient building techniques. The internal ramp theory. Instead of a massive external ramp, Houdin suggests that the ancient Egyptians built the main ramp inside the pyramid itself, spiraling upward as the structure grew. Now, this theory solves multiple problems simultaneously. An internal ramp would require far less material than an external one, explaining the absence of massive ramp remains. The ramp would have been built into the pyramid structure, then sealed as construction progressed upward. Houdin's theory is supported by several intriguing pieces of evidence. Thermal anomalies detected within the pyramid suggest the presence of internal voids that could represent sealed ramp passages. Additionally, certain irregularities in the pyramid's outer surface, previously unexplained notches and protrusions, align perfectly with where internal ramp openings would have been allocated. The internal ramp would have functioned as a continuous spiral, allowing workers to transport blocks efficiently to any level of the pyramid. This method would have been far more efficient than an external ramp, requiring fewer workers and less material while maintaining the security of the construction site. Computer simulations of Houdin's internal ramp system demonstrate that it could have functioned effectively, providing adequate space for workers and materials while maintaining the structural integrity of the growing pyramid. The theory has gained support from several prominent Egyptologists who see it as an elegant solution to the ramp problem. A more radical alternative theory suggests the ancient Egyptians used water power for both cutting and lifting the massive stones. This theory, championed by various researchers, proposes that the Egyptians had a more sophisticated understanding of hydraulics than previously recognized. The hydraulic lifting theory suggests that the Egyptians created an internal system of locks and water-filled shafts that could float heavy blocks to higher levels. Using the annual Nile flood, water would be channeled into chambers within the pyramid, creating a system of water elevators. This theory is supported by the discovery of sophisticated water management systems throughout ancient Egypt, including the irrigation networks that supported Egyptian agriculture. The Egyptians were master hydraulic engineers, capable of moving massive quantities of water across great distances. The internal shafts within the pyramid, traditionally interpreted as air shafts for the pharaoh's spirit, could have served as part of this hydraulic system. Their precise angles and dimensions are consistent with water channels designed to control flow and pressure. Even more intriguingly, some researchers propose that the Egyptians used water-powered cutting techniques to achieve the precision seen in the pyramid stonework. This could have involved large, water-lubricated saws, or even high-pressure water jets. Evidence for advanced cutting techniques includes the presence of perfectly straight cuts in granite blocks, some showing parallel scratches that suggest the use of multi-bladed cutting tools. The precision of these cuts exceeds what would be expected from hand tools, suggesting mechanical assistance. Archaeological evidence from other ancient sites shows that water-powered machinery was not unknown in the ancient world. The Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of hydraulics, combined with their access to the Nile's predictable flood cycles, could have provided the power source for advanced cutting and lifting systems. Perhaps the most controversial alternative theory comes from French materials scientist Joseph Davidovits, whose background in polymer chemistry led him to a startling conclusion. At least some of the pyramid's blocks were not quarried stone at all, but rather an advanced form of ancient concrete. The theory proposes that instead of quarrying massive blocks and transporting them across great distances, the Egyptians mixed crushed limestone with a binding agent, possibly natron, a naturally occurring sodium compound abundant in Egypt, to create a malleable material that could be cast in place. This approach would solve the problems of transportation, lifting, and precision fitting in a single stroke. Blocks could be cast directly in their final positions, explaining the perfect joints and precise positioning seen throughout the pyramid. The material would have been light enough to transport as separate components, then mixed and cast on site. Davidovits supports his theory with microscopic analysis of pyramid stone samples, which he claims show evidence of rapid chemical settings and air bubbles consistent with cast concrete rather than natural limestone. He also points to the presence of organic fibers and other materials within the stones that would not naturally occur in limestone. Critics argue that the geopolymer theory lacks sufficient archaeological evidence, and that the microscopic features Davidovich identifies could have natural explanations. However, the theory continues to gain attention as it elegantly explains many of the construction challenges that still perplex us today. While the orthodox view presents the Great Pyramid as unambiguously a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, several troubling facts challenge this interpretation. These aren't minor inconsistencies, but fundamental problems that question whether the pyramid's primary purpose was truly burial. The most glaring issue is the complete absence of any pharaoh's remains. Despite thorough exploration of the pyramid's interior, no mummy, burial artifacts, or evidence of a royal interment has ever been found in the Great Pyramid. This absence is remarkable, given that every other confirmed royal tomb in Egypt has yielded at least some evidence of burial, even when heavily looted. The standard explanation that tomb robbers removed everything faces serious challenges. The pyramid's interior passages are narrow, very difficult to navigate, making the removal of a heavy sarcophagus and associated burial goods extremely challenging. Moreover, tomb robbers typically left behind smaller artifacts, yet the pyramid's interior is completely barren of any burial-related materials. The granite box in the king's chamber, identified as Khufu's sarcophagus, presents its own mysteries. Unlike the elaborately decorated sarcophagi found in other royal tombs, this box is completely unadorned, lacking hieroglyphs, religious texts, or any indication of royal association. More puzzling is the sarcophagus's dimensions and finish. It's larger than the chamber's entrance, meaning it had to be placed during construction rather than after completion. The interior is roughly finished with visible tool marks, lacking the smooth, polished surface expected in a royal burial container. The lid is missing and has never been found, despite extensive searches. The pyramid's interior is starkly functional, completely lacking the elaborate texts that cover every surface of confirmed royal tombs. The walls of tombs in the Valley of the Kings are covered with spells from the Book of the Dead, religious imagery, and detailed accounts of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. The Great Pyramid's interior contains none of these elements. This absence is particularly striking, given that pyramid texts, the earliest known religious writings, appear in later pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties. If the Great Pyramid was indeed a tomb, why would it lack the religious texts considered essential for the pharaoh's afterlife journey? In the 1990s, Belgian construction engineer Robert Boval, working alongside writer Adrian Gilbert, made an observation that would revolutionize pyramid research. Looking up at the night sky from Giza, Boval noticed something extraordinary. The 3 pyramids on the ground perfectly mirrored the 3 stars of Orion's belt in the heavens. The theory centers on the remarkable correspondence between the 3 Giza pyramids and the 3 stars of Orion's belt. When viewed from above, the pyramid's relative positions, sizes, and orientations precisely mirror the constellation the ancient Egyptians associated with Osiris, their god of the dead and rebirth. This correlation extends beyond mere positioning. The Great Pyramid's internal shafts, traditionally called air shafts, point with remarkable precision to specific stars that held religious significance for the ancient Egyptians. The southern shaft from the king's chamber targets Orion, while the northern shaft points to the pole star. Similar alignments exist for the Queen's chamber shafts. The astronomical purpose theory suggests that the pyramid functioned as a sophisticated instrument for tracking celestial cycles, particularly the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle that causes the apparent position of stars to shift gradually over time. The ancient Egyptians, according to this theory, possessed advanced astronomical knowledge that allowed them to encode cosmic cycles into their monuments. Supporting evidence includes the pyramid's precise orientation to cardinal directions and its mathematical relationships that mirror astronomical constants. The structure's internal geometry incorporates the golden ratio, pi, and other mathematical relationships that appear throughout cosmic structures. A fascinating alternative theory proposes that the Great Pyramid was engineered as a massive acoustic resonance chamber designed to harness and amplify specific sound frequencies for ritual, healing, or consciousness-altering purposes. This theory emerged from careful acoustic analysis of the pyramid's interior chambers, particularly the King's Chamber and its granite coffer. Researchers have discovered that the chamber resonates at a specific frequency, approximately 110 Hz, when sound is introduced. This frequency is significant because it corresponds to the fundamental resonance of the human skull and has been associated with altered states of consciousness in various cultures. The granite coffer, rather than being a sarcophagus, may have been designed as a resonating chamber. Its dimensions and the acoustic properties of granite create a powerful resonance effect when struck or when sound is introduced. The coffer's interior volume and proportions are precisely calculated to amplify specific frequencies. The pyramid's internal architecture supports this acoustic theory. The grand gallery, with its unique corbelled ceiling and precise dimensions, functions as a resonance chamber that amplifies and focuses sound waves. The ascending and descending passages create acoustic pathways that would channel sound throughout the structure. Archaeological evidence from other ancient sites supports the importance of acoustics in ancient religious practices. Many stone circles, temples, and ceremonial sites worldwide demonstrate sophisticated acoustic design, suggesting that ancient cultures understood and utilized sound's power for spiritual and healing purposes. The acoustic theory proposes that the pyramid was used for initiation ceremonies, healing rituals, or consciousness expanding practices. Participants would enter the chambers and experience specific sound frequencies that induced altered states of consciousness, spiritual experiences, or healing effects. The most radical alternative theory comes from American machinist Christopher Dunn, whose background in precision manufacturing and aerospace engineering brought a unique perspective to pyramid research. In his groundbreaking book, The Giza Power Plant, Dunn proposed something that seemed impossible. The Great Pyramid was actually a sophisticated machine designed to generate and transmit energy. The power plant theory suggests that the pyramid utilized several energy sources working in combination. The massive granite blocks contain quartz crystals that exhibit certain properties. They generate electrical charges when subjected to mechanical stress. The pyramid's enormous weight, combined with natural seismic activity and Earth's rotation, would create constant mechanical stress in these granite elements. The theory proposes that underground water channels beneath the pyramid created chemical reactions that contributed to the energy generation process. The pyramid's internal chambers would have contained chemical solutions that would create electrical charges that could be harvested and converted. The missing capstone, according to this theory, wasn't decorative, but functional. A structure that would have focused and transmitted the generated energy, possibly in the form of microwaves. The pyramid's precise mathematical relationships and positioning would have been essential for efficient energy generation and transmission. Supporting evidence includes the pyramid's location on geological fault lines that would provide natural seismic energy, the presence of underground water channels that could support chemical reactions, and the sophisticated ventilation system that could have managed gas byproducts from chemical processes. The power plant theory suggests that the ancient Egyptians possessed advanced knowledge of physics, chemistry, and energy generation that has been lost to modern civilization. The pyramid represents not just architectural achievement, but technological sophistication far beyond what orthodox archaeology attributes to ancient cultures. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that the Great Pyramid's true nature cannot be captured by any single theory. The evidence suggests a structure that served multiple purposes simultaneously. A unified design that integrated burial, astronomical observation, acoustic resonance, and possibly energy generation into a single sophisticated machine. This theory proposes that the pyramid was indeed designed as a tomb, but one whose architecture was based on precise celestial alignments and acoustic principles. The structure could have functioned as a burial chamber, whose design incorporated astronomical knowledge, built using advanced engineering techniques, and which also served as a resonance chamber for initiation rituals or healing practices. The missing pieces of this puzzle may lie in understanding how the ancient Egyptians integrated multiple functions into a single design. The pyramid's internal chambers could have served astronomical, acoustic, and burial purposes simultaneously. Precise mathematical relationships encoded in the structure suggest a level of integrated planning that encompassed multiple disciplines we now consider separate. Regardless of which theory ultimately proves correct, the evidence consistently points to a civilization with a far more sophisticated understanding of mathematics, engineering, geology, and astronomy than traditional archaeology acknowledges. The Great Pyramid represents not just architectural achievement, but a monument to knowledge, a capability that challenges our assumptions about ancient civilizations. The pyramid's greatest mystery may not be how it was built or why, but rather what it reveals about the true capabilities of our ancestors. Every attempt to explain its construction pushes the boundaries of what we believed possible for Bronze Age civilization. Every theory about its purpose suggests knowledge, understanding that we're only beginning to rediscover. The Great Pyramid stands as a testament to human ingenuity and ambition, but also as a humbling reminder of how much we still don't know about our own history. It challenges us to remain open to possibilities that don't fit our current understanding, and to continue questioning the assumptions we've inherited about the past. And so, in the end, perhaps the pyramid's true purpose today is exactly what it has always been. To inspire all, to challenge our understanding, and to drive our eternal quest for knowledge. As we continue to study this ancient wonder, with ever more sophisticated tools and techniques, we may find that the greatest discovery is not what the pyramid was, but what it reveals about the limitless potential. Thousands of years after it supposedly sank into the cold and gloomy depths of the Atlantic Ocean, the island continent of Atlantis lives on as one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. If indeed such a place existed, Atlantis was a civilization unequaled before or since. Yet its chroniclers say that it vanished in little more than a single day, leaving not a trace behind. The oldest and fullest surviving account of the great island's rise and fall was provided by the Greek philosopher Plato in the 4th century BC. According to Plato's description, Atlantis was a land where skilled farmers created sweet-scented orchards and where animals, including a very large stock of elephants, flourished. Within its chief city were innumerable mansions outdone in grandeur only by the royal palace and by the nearby temple raised to honor Poseidon. But neither gold nor glory could save the Atlanteans from themselves. Their growing materialism mightily offended the gods, wrote Plato, and the whole civilization was condemned to a swift and spectacular end. Atlantis has often been linked with other places of mystery, among them the pyramids of Egypt and the stone slabs of Stonehenge. Unlike those brooding monuments, however, the land that Plato portrayed is no more tangible than memory or dreams. But many people believe that the drowned country's wealth of silver, copper and gold still glimmers for the finding on the ocean floor. Perhaps one day, they say, some bold salvager may even bring to light Atlantis' fabled golden tablets, graven with the laws of earthly paradise. On April 12, 1939, a 62-year-old man sank into a trance-like state and spoke of the last days of a long-lost world. If his thoughts were disjointed, his meaning was as clear as it was startling. In Atlantis, he said, where there was the breaking up of the land, came to what was called the Mayan land, or what is now Yucatan. An entity was the first to cross the water in the plane or air machine of that period. The speaker was Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, because he invariably experienced his visions in a seeming stupor. For 2 decades, this enigmatic American seer would astound listeners with confidently detailed pronouncements about the fabled island continent of Atlantis. Hailed as a greatly gifted clairvoyant and healer, Cayce told of an ancient place that, before it was swallowed by the ocean, had produced technological marvels not to be seen again until the 20th century. He spoke of living men and women who, in earlier incarnations, had been citizens of this vanished continental nation. He recounted how survivors of the final cataclysm had found out by various means, some on board Atlantean aircraft, to bear remnants of their knowledge and achievements to nearly all the corners of the globe. Cayce's Chronicles of Atlantis did not fail to fascinate, for the lost continent remains tightly woven into the fabric of human heritage, a land that has tantalized philosophers and poets, historians and schemers, scientists and explorers for more than 2 millennia. Ever since the Greek philosopher Plato described it in his writings 355 years before the birth of Christ. The story of Atlantis has spoken to generation after generation about the power and wisdom of the ancients. It is a recollection of Eden, a paradise resting now in the dragon-green depths of the sea. Human ambitions may vault beyond the earth to the moon and planets, and even the most distant stars. But memories of that wondrous continent still persist, and not alone in the stranger revelations of Edgar Cayce. The world is filled with mysterious sights, regions, and structures that excite the imagination and lead to speculation about their origins and purposes. Some, such as Atlantis and the secret innards of the earth, are unseen, perhaps existing only in the minds of believers. Others are highly visible, but inscrutable nonetheless. They continue to be a grist for the doubter and the true believer, the charlatan and the honestly curious. But of all the mystic places, the most enigmatic and the source of many of the rest is the lost island continent of Atlantis, the subject of more than 2,000 books and countless articles and poems. Atlantis has been traced to a long list of sites and regions in the world, among them most of the oceans and continents, to mountain ranges such as the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, to the deserts in Sahara, to islands such as Malta in the Mediterranean and Bimini in the Caribbean. The supposed civilization of Atlantis, long vanished from the earth, has been hailed for spawning a number of other known civilizations, including those of Greece, the Mayas, and Incas of the New World, and even ancient Egypt. It has also been linked to the high cultures of two other allegedly lost continents, Mu and Lemuria. The first known account of Atlantis was supplied by Greek thinker Plato, a student of the philosopher Socrates. Plato formed his own school of philosophy. He wrote out his philosophy in the form of dialogues, playlets that featured his former teacher Socrates as the main character. Such is the case in the Republic, the dialogue in which Socrates and his interlocutors work out their ideal philosophy of government. Apparently, Plato tried but failed to persuade the ruler of Syracuse, in what is now Sicily, to adopt his political philosophy. Then, late in life, he composed two more dialogues that picked up where the Republic had left off. It is in these, Timaeus and Critias, written around 355 BC, when Plato was in his 70s, that the earliest surviving description of the lost continent appears. Plato's Timaeus, one of the original characters in the Republic, was an astronomer. Most of the dialogue for him deals with what was then known about the natural world and its origins. The dialogue is written as if it had occurred the day after the conversation that makes up the Republic, before Timaeus speaks about the natural sciences. Another remarkable discussant, Critias the historian, says that he knows of a place where the philosophy of governance had been just as proposed in the Republic. The story of that privileged locale, Critias explains, had been passed down to him from relatives by word of mouth and a few scribbled notes by the Greek statesman Solon, who had heard it a century and a half earlier from Egyptian priests. According to the Egyptians, the place that matched the ideals of the Republic was none other than Athens. But It had been an Athens of a much earlier time, some 9,000 years before, in fact. There, Athenia, the goddess of wisdom, had established a city that would produce men of the greatest wisdom, and as it turned out, courage. For beyond the Pillars of Hercules, there was a threatening island larger than northern Africa and Asia Minor combined. That is, a continent equal in size to most of the known world in Plato's day. On the island continent, a great and marvelous power had risen. This was Atlantis, and its kings had extended their influence well into the Mediterranean as far as central Italy and Egypt. The Atlanteans, in fact, were arrogantly seeking control of all the world. Then, the Athenian warriors defeated the armies of Atlantis in a great battle, and the city's leaders liberated all those east of the Pillars of Hercules. But on the heels of this glorious victory came violent earthquakes and floods that destroyed the early Athenians and sank the entire continent of Atlantis under the sea, all in a devastating period of a day and a night. Such catastrophes, the Egyptian priest had informed Solon, was certainly common enough in the world, but the Greeks had lost the early records of their history. Egypt, thanks to the value action of its regularly flooding Nile River, was protected from such disasters. Thus, it still retained knowledge of ancient cataclysms. With that brief mention of an early war, Atlantis became a tantalizing part of the historical record, but it remained for Critias, in the dialogue named for him, to describe Atlantis in detail. Indeed, the very quantity and quality of information in Critias has given Plato's account of Atlantis much of its enduring plausibility. Critias's report is filled with architectural, engineering, and ceremonial detail that would hardly have been needed if all Plato had in mind was to create a parable or legend to help him make a philosophical point. Moreover, Plato laced the dialogue of Critias with uncharacteristic references to the tale as the realm of fact and genuine history. And Solon, who supposedly brought the story back to Greece, was a real person who had actually visited Egypt as a statesman. All in all, Plato took great pains to make his record of Atlantis seem credible to the readers of his time, and that tone of certainty has remained a challenge for more than 2,000 years. Today, of course, few people believe in Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, or in any of the rest of the Hellenic pantheon. But when Critias resumed his account of Atlantis, he quite naturally spoke in terms of divine origins. In the earliest of times, he explained, when the gods were dividing the earth among themselves, Poseidon chose the fair and bounteous continent and the islands that would come to be known as Atlantis. There, with a woman named Cleito, he sired 5 sets of twin sons. The firstborn child was Atlas, for whom the continent and the surrounding ocean were named. Poseidon divided Atlantis into 10 parts, granting Atlas the biggest and best portion and making him sovereign over his brothers, who were made rulers over the remaining provinces. Atlantis was a land of bountiful plains, extensive stands of timber, and a rich flora and fauna, including great herds of elephants. The ground was seamed with the ore of gold, silver, and other metals, including a copper that Plato wrote sparkled like fire. At the southern end of the continent, the kings built a city of magnificence to match the great power that so rich a land soon achieved. This city, also called Atlantis, consisted of concentric rings of land and waterways. In the center, on a high hill where Poseidon and Cleito had conceived Atlas and his twin brother, the Atlanteans raised a great temple to Poseidon, with a statue of the god riding a golden chariot through the sea in the company of dolphins. In the city, there were springs, both hot and cold, some for the use of the kings, others for the citizens, still others for the beasts of burden. The outer rings held a race course and houses for the citizens. The inner harbors were filled with the vessels of war. For generations, the 10 kings ruled their respective domains, abiding always by the firm laws set down long before by Poseidon. At alternative intervals of 5 and 6 years, the monarchs would meet together and perform a long and complex ceremony in which a wild bull, captured with a noose, was sacrificed and its blood allowed to course down over sacred bronze columns in a temple. Afterward, the kings donned sacred dark robes and discussed among themselves any transgressions between kingdoms that might have occurred in the interval since the last assembly. They inscribed the results of these deliberations on tablets of gold. It was not long before Atlantis, gifted with wealth, strength, and internal harmony, began to extend its power outward. But at the same time, the divine and virtuous character of its populace had begun to weaken with the passage of years. Human nature, Critias reported, got the upper hand. The Atlanteans began to exhibit less seemly qualities: uncurbed ambition, greed and ugliness grew among the citizens and their rulers as well. Perceiving that an honorable race was in a woeful plight, Critias said. Zeus summoned the gods to determine what punishment to inflict on Atlantis, and when he had called them together, he spoke as follows. And this is where Critias breaks off. For unknown reasons, Plato ended his chronicle of Atlantis before he had given the details, only touched upon in the earlier dialogue of Timaeus, of the war with the Atlanteans and the terrible earthquake and floods that sank the once blessed continent into the depths of the sea. Despite Plato's best efforts to make Atlantis seem real, his descriptive account was soon the subject of controversy. Even his student Aristotle claimed that Plato had fabricated the Atlantis story and contrived the continent's catastrophic demise as a literary convenience. For many centuries after, scholarship in the Western world was based on the reading of texts by the greats of earlier times, and philosophers generally aligned themselves in schools of thought that were either Aristotelian or Platonic. The Platonists claimed that Plato's account of Atlantis was straight history, while Aristotelians took the opposite point of view and maintained that the lost continent was pure myth. Even so, it was easy enough to believe that a mysterious land might once have existed in the vastness of the Atlantic. The seas beyond the Strait of Gibraltar remained largely unexplored, and, in the minds and maps of men, were perilously laced with reefs and shallows, not to mention strange and dangerous creatures. There were plenty of corroborative stories about other Atlantic landforms. O Gygea, in the epics of the Greek poet Homer, for instance, that lend credence to the Platonic account of the lost continent. And here and there, in old texts, was circumstantial evidence for those predisposed to believe it. For example, in an offhand comment about the geographical distribution of seals, a 2nd century Roman naturalist had written that the royalty of Macedonia, like the king of Atlantis, had worn headbands adorned with the image of a ram seal. Presumably, the real-life Macedonians had adopted this emblem in emulation of equally substantial Atlanteans. During the period known as the Dark Ages, however, European scholars turned their attention almost exclusively from worldly matters to theology and the business of the church. Atlantis was, for many centuries, a matter of relatively small concern. But with the coming of the Renaissance, many thinkers returned hungrily to the classical texts of Greece and Rome, and there, once again, they found Atlantis. Meanwhile, seafarers probed the great ocean to the west. Sometimes their journeys spawned legends. For example, in the 13th century, the Irish monk St. Brendan sailed west in search of paradise and supposedly encountered sea monsters and demonic beings and discovered the Isles of the Blessed, which took their various places on generations of maps. By the time Columbus set sail, map makers had endowed the Atlantic Ocean with numerous other islands, both real and imagined. Among them, Avalon, the fabled land where King Arthur was said to have gone after receiving mortal wounds at the Battle of Camlan. Close by were the Azores and the Canaries, lying only a few hundred miles off the coast of North Africa. Some scholars believe that these islands may be the mountainous remnants of a sunken land. When the New World burst upon the European consciousness, the Americas quickly became prime candidates for the location of Atlantis. A Spaniard, Francesca Lopez de Gomara, first made the suggestion in 1553, and Sir Francis Bacon adopted it when he wrote The New Atlantis, a utopian novel. But the origins of Atlantis were also sought elsewhere, often with the spirit of chauvinism inherent in the rise of European nationalism. In 1675, Olaf Rudbeck, a Swedish scholar, used Homeric sailing directions to Ojibwa and located Atlantis in Sweden. The English poet William Blake believed that the Atlantean king Albion led the last of his subjects to Britain, where they became Druids. Ancient Egyptians, Goths, and Siths were all seen to be escapees from the doomed Atlantis. As time passed and geographical knowledge grew, such notions began to look increasingly far-fetched. Even students of Plato had their doubts. In 1841, the French scholar T. Henry Martin wrote a commentary on Timaeus and called Atlantis pure fiction. The geography of Europe, Asia, and Africa, he pointed out, showed none of the profound effects that would have followed the cataclysmic disappearance of Atlantis. Martin concluded that the search for Atlantis was a futile cause. The vanished continent, he said, was truly a utopia, which means literally no place. With Martin's authoritative broadside, Atlantis might well have been banished roundly to the realm of myth, never again to be put forward as a real place. But within a few decades, the lost continent found a new and eloquent champion, and a highly unlikely one at that. Ignatius Donnelly was a man of many dreams and ambitions, Born in Philadelphia in 1831, he was the son of an impoverished Irish immigrant who had abandoned his academic studies for the Roman Catholic priesthood, become a shopkeeper, and then gone on to study medicine. Donnelly's mother worked as a pawnbroker to help put her husband through medical school. Unfortunately, for the growing Donnelly family, the freshly minted physician contracted typhus from a patient and died just 2 years after starting his medical practice. Donnelly's strong-willed mother, 6 months pregnant at the time, never remarried, but devoted herself to raising her children. She was a strict disciplinarian who encouraged her offspring to excel. Her daughters would later joke that their mother had shattered many a pair of eyeglasses with her piercing looks. Following his graduation from the prestigious Central High School, where he lived up to his mother's expectations by reading widely and developing a striking talent for writing poetry and prose, the short, red-haired Ignatius Donnelly hired on as a clerk for an up-and-coming Philadelphia lawyer. After 3 years, qualified to be a lawyer himself, Donnelly set up his own practice. Drawn into democratic politics, he soon made his mark and drew praise from the powerful Senator John C. Breckinridge. Donnelly had been a voracious reader ever since his days at Central High School. His diverse interests ranged from archaeology and geology to linguistics and history. During his off hours as a congressman in Washington, he had often strolled to the Library of Congress to study the latest books and journals in these fields. Then, sometime in the 1870s, Donnelly developed an abiding fascination for the lost continent. With that, his previously random studies took on a distinct focus. In nearly everything he read, he seemed to find echoes of a long-vanished civilization. Now, back home, with his political ambitions in tatters, Donnelly turned for solace in his dreams of Atlantis. By mid-January of 1881, he could note more cheerfully in his diary that he was beavering away on a book of his own, a book that he simply called Atlantis. When he was not at work, in the comfortable book-filled study of his home, Donnelly could often be found at D.D. Merrill's well-stocked bookstore in nearby St. Paul. There, he picked up the latest scientific journals and bought volume after volume on history, geography, mythology, and world literature. Reading and writing at a furious pace, laboring long into the night, Donnelly became more and more convinced than ever that Plato's Atlantis had existed, and just where Plato had said it was. He further concluded that Atlanteans were the first men to achieve civilization, and that the deities of various ancient mythologies were in fact the actual royalty of Atlantis. As Donnelly saw it, refugees from Atlantis had fanned out around the world and created many civilizations. In Egypt, in India, in Central America, and elsewhere. Indeed, Donnelly attributed a great deal more to Atlantis than had Plato or any other commentator. In poring over scientific literature, Donnelly found no shortage of authorities whose writings seemed to bolster his own notions. Scientists of the day knew, for example, of what would later be called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a volcano-dotted fracture stretching north and south through the Atlantic Sea bottom. Sir Charles Lyell, the leading geologist of the 19th century, had observed in his landmark, Principles of Geology, that a group of islands arising at some future time along that line would acquire inestimable commercial and political influence. Upon reading that, Donnelly required no great leap of the imagination to envision such influential islands descending as well as arising along the same fracture. Donnelly also found corroboration for his developing Atlantis theories in the world of botany. The German botanist Otto Kunst, for example, had written that the principal domesticated tropical plants of Asia and the Americas were of the same species. Kunst cited especially the banana, which required an extended period of intelligent and determined cultivation to achieve its seedless domestic form. For Donnelly, the message was clear. The banana had first been cultivated in Atlantis, then transplanted to its modern habitats. He saw a like explanation for the similarities that paleontologists were finding between the prehistoric animal life of Europe and America. More important for his thesis, Donnelly discerned far too many similarities between widely separated cultures to be explainable as mere coincidence. As his research led him to find legends from Asian civilizations, American Indian cultures, and the ancient civilizations of the Middle East, Donnelly totally rejected the possibility that such kindred stories could have arisen by chance. The only possible explanation for so universal a concept, he concluded, had to be a single source: the lost continent of Atlantis, from which the tale of deluge had spread, changing slightly, but not importantly through centuries of oral transmission. This sort of pattern loomed wherever Donnelly looked. A favourite symbol of the Bronze Age, he found, was the spiral, and spiral images cropped up at old sites in Scotland, in Switzerland, and in the rock face carvings of the Sioux Indians in New Mexico. On a far larger scale, Donnelly contemplated the similarities between the pyramids of Egypt and those found in Mexico. Even the mysterious mounds scattered throughout the Mississippi Valley were pyramidal. Even in linguistics, the murkiest area of all, Donnelly perceived analogues that suggested a common origin of the world's languages. And he piled up example after example. The Chinese word for brick was ku. The Chaldean word for brick was K. For cloth, both used the word sick, finding evidence that variants of a single mother tongue ran from Iceland to Ceylon. He went on to write that a wider generalization was reasonable. There is abundant proof, he wrote, proof with which pages might be filled, that there was still an older mother tongue, the language of Noah, the language of Atlantis, the language of the great aggressive empire of Plato. Writing at a feverish pace, Donnelly completed his book in mid-March of 1881. Soon afterward, armed with letters of introduction from his St. Paul bookseller, he traveled to New York to make the rounds of the major publishers. Donnelly's Atlantis went on sale in early 1882. Not even the enthusiastic author was fully prepared for the acclaim it elicited. Early reviews called it plausible and suggested that it was one of the most notable books of the century. William Gladstone, Great Britain's Prime Minister at the time, read the book and wrote Donnelly a glowing letter. Donnelly's vision of the lost continent found an immense audience. New Orleans would devote its Mardi Gras celebration the next year to the theme of Atlantis. And so great was the book's reception in America and abroad that its author was elected to membership in the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Atlantis was soon available in translation throughout Europe, and many people on both sides of the Atlantic were thoroughly convinced by Donnelly's marshalling of evidence from science, literature, folklore, and mythology. Born in 1877, the son of a Kentucky farmer, Edgar Casey had to leave school in the 7th grade to go to work. Later, he hoped to become a preacher, but came down with a throat ailment that reduced his voice to the merest whisper. After doctors failed to cure him, he asked a friend to put him in a hypnotic trance. In this state, Casey spoke out in a loud, firm voice, diagnosing his problem and prescribing the remedy that ultimately worked. Henceforth, there would be two Edgar Caseys, the sleeping and the waking. For years, until his death in 1945, Casey spent a great deal of his time submerged in deep trances, seeking the causes of people's physical ailments and disabilities, as well as prescribing cures. In the 1920s, the sleeping Casey began to stress the existence of reincarnation, the rebirth of departed souls in new bodies. Often, when tracking a patient's previous lives, what were known as life readings, as opposed to readings made for healing purposes, Casey would allude cryptically to a previous life in Atlantis, calling the spirit from that earlier time an entity. One subject of a life reading was told, in Atlantean land, entity ruled in pomp and power, and in understanding of the mysteries of the application of that often termed the night side of life, or in applying the universal forces as understood in the period. A relatively simple man, Casey was deeply religious and was not widely read. He was sometimes astounded to learn what he had said in a trance state. And the waking Casey worried for a time about his sleeping counterpart's ideas about reincarnation, fearing that they might be unchristian. In fact, the Atlantean references seemed almost incidental. But like all of Casey's readings after 1932, when an institute was founded to support his work, they were written down. In 650 different readings that Casey gave for different people over a period of 21 years, a vivid picture of the ancient world of Atlantis emerged. And the picture was remarkably consistent in its own terms. The accumulated fragments do not contradict themselves. Casey's Atlantis was right where Plato had said it was, in the Atlantic Ocean. The position the continent of Atlantis occupied, he said, in a reading given in 1932, is between the Gulf of Mexico on the one hand and the Mediterranean upon the other. It was of continental size, and people lived there for thousands of years, during which it went through 3 great catastrophic periods of a breakup, the last being about 10,000 years ago, when it disappeared. Before the end, however, the Atlanteans appeared to have developed a highly advanced civilization that was technologically on par with the industrialized world of the 20th century. They were evidently an active, questing people who could, among other things, generate electricity and build aircraft. As Casey intoned during a life reading, entity was what would be in the present the electrical engineer, applied those forces or influences for airplanes, ships, and what you would today call radio for constructive or destructive purposes. Casey also spoke cryptically of an Atlantean substance called firestone. Used to generate energy, it has been likened by some to the radioactive materials employed in modern times to produce nuclear power. As Casey explained in a reading more than a decade before the first public demonstration of atomic energy, he said, "The preparation of this stone was solely in the hands of the initiates at the time, and the entity was among those who directed the influences of the radiation which arose in the form of rays that were invisible to the eye, but acted upon the stones themselves as set in the motivating forces, whether the aircraft were lifted by the gases of the period, or crafts on the water or underwater. These vehicles," Casey went on to say, "were impelled by the concentration of rays from the stone, which was centered in the middle of the power station. According to Edgar Casey's account, the Atlanteans had originally appeared on Earth in spirit form and had only gradually evolved into material beings. This was, it seems, the beginning of the end for Atlantis. The more fleshy its inhabitants became over the generations, the more troubled their civilization became." Casey said in 1937, during a sleep state in Atlantean land, when there were those disturbing forces, or just previous to the first disturbing forces that brought the first destruction of the continent, through the application of spiritual things for self-indulgent of material peoples. A faction called the Sons of Belial finally gained control of Atlantis, mistreating the land's producers and casting them into a kind of slave status. Society, like the land itself, began to fall apart, and Casey suggested that the cataclysmic end was caused not only by geological upheavals, but also by misuse of technology. In addition to telling the life and death of Atlantis, Casey also made a tantalizing prediction. In the late 1960s, he said the western region of the long submerged continent would begin to reappear near the Caribbean island of Bimini. And then, in 1968, divers happened to find in the waters just off Bimini what seemed to be a long roadway paved with rectangular blocks of stone. Many believed that the sleeping Casey's prophecy had come to pass, that this was an actual remnant of the vanished Atlantean civilization. Indeed, radiocarbon dating of the monumental blocks indicated an age of some 12,000 years.